Every morning, as the sun began to rise and paint the sky with shades of orange and pink, Henry Thompson would start his day just like clockwork. He'd wake up at 5:30 a.m., brew himself a strong cup of coffee, and head out to the bus depot by 6:15. His yellow school bus was more than just a vehicle. It was his second home. For over 20 years, Henry had been driving kids to and from school, learning their quirks, their habits, and sometimes even their secrets. Some days were quiet, others loud, but every day brought something new. Henry wasn't your average bus driver. Sure, he knew how to handle the steering wheel, navigate tricky routes, and keep the peace among rowdy students. But what set him apart was his ability to notice things, small details that most people overlooked. Whether it was a child carrying an unusually heavy backpack or another sitting alone in silence, Henry paid attention. It wasn't nosiness, it was care. Over the years, he'd learned that paying attention could make all the difference. One particular passenger always stood out to him, a young girl named Amina Johnson. She lived on Maple Street, one of the stops near the beginning of his route. Every weekday, without fail, she'd be standing at the corner by 7:15 a.m., waiting patiently for the bus. She was only 11 years old, but there was something about her demeanor that made her seem older than her age. Her curly hair was often tied back neatly, and her uniform pressed perfectly, yet her eyes told a different story. They weren't bright and full of energy like those of her peers. Instead, they carried a sadness that weighed heavily on her small frame. What struck Henry the most was that Amina cried almost every single morning. Not openly, though. She didn't sob uncontrollably or let tears stream down her cheeks. Instead, she tried to hide it, wiping her face quickly before stepping onto the bus. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of her red-rimmed eyes through the rearview mirror as she took her usual seat in the third row near the window. Other times, he'd notice her trembling hands gripping the straps of her backpack tightly, as if holding on for dear life. At first, Henry assumed it was nothing serious. Maybe she missed her parents, struggled with schoolwork, or had a fight with a friend. Kids went through phases like that all the time, right? But as the weeks rolled by, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Day after day, Amina boarded the bus looking heartbroken, her shoulders slumped, and her gaze fixed firmly outside the window. No matter how many other children laughed, chattered, or played around her, she remained silent, lost in her own world. Henry found himself watching her more closely than the others. Was she being bullied? Did she have trouble at home? These questions swirled in his mind, especially during the long stretches of quiet when the bus rumbled along empty roads. Yet despite his growing curiosity, he hesitated to ask directly. Privacy was sacred to him, and he didn't want to invade hers. Still, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something bigger was going on beneath the surface. On some mornings, Amina seemed worse than usual. There were days when she looked exhausted, dark circles underlining her already somber expression. On others, she appeared disheveled, her clothes slightly rumpled or damp as if she'd rushed to get ready. Once, Henry noticed a faint bruise peeking out from under her sleeve. He wanted to say something then, to pull her aside and gently inquire. But fear held him back. What if he misunderstood? What if he embarrassed her or made things worse? Instead, he chose to observe. He memorized the way she sat stiffly in her seat, clutching her backpack like a shield. He noted how she avoided eye contact with everyone, including him, and how her voice never joined the chorus of laughter echoing through the bus. Slowly but surely, these observations added up to form a picture, one that unsettled him deeply. Despite his concerns, Henry admired Amina's resilience. Even in her pain, she showed remarkable strength. She never caused trouble, never complained, and always followed the rules. If anything, she seemed determined to blend into the background, hoping no one would notice her struggles. But Henry did notice, and it ate away at him. How could someone so young carry such a heavy burden? And why did it feel like no one else cared enough to see it? As the days turned into weeks, Henry grew increasingly conflicted. Part of him wanted to step in, to offer comfort or guidance. Another part reminded him that he was Just a bus driver. Not a counselor, teacher, or parent. Who was he to interfere in someone else's life? Yet every time Amina climbed aboard the bus with tear-streaked cheeks, his heart clenched a little tighter. Something had to give. Little did he know, the answer was closer than he thought, and it would change both their lives forever. The discovery of the crumpled note under Amina's seat left Henry reeling, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He sat there on the bus floor for several minutes, staring at the words scrawled across the paper. Please don't tell anyone what happens at home. The plea was simple yet devastating. It spoke volumes about the fear and helplessness that had been silently consuming Amina day after day. And then there were the drawings, stick figures frozen in moments of violence, their stick-like arms raised in anger or defense. To Henry, they weren't just crude sketches. They were cries for help, desperate attempts to communicate what she couldn't say aloud. As he held the note in trembling hands, Henry felt an overwhelming mix of anger, sadness, and guilt. Anger, because no child should ever have to endure such pain. Sadness because Amina, who seemed so small and fragile, was carrying this burden all by herself. Guilt because he hadn't acted sooner. How many mornings had he watched her cry without realizing the depth of her suffering? Had he dismissed her tears as mere childhood troubles when they were actually signs of something far more sinister? Henry knew he couldn't ignore what he'd found. This wasn't just another lost lunchbox or forgotten sweater. It was evidence of something deeply wrong. But how could he proceed? What was the right thing to do? His mind raced with questions and possibilities. Should he confront Amina directly? No, that didn't feel right. She had tried to hide the note for a reason, likely fearing retaliation if anyone found out. Confrontation might only make her situation worse. Should he call her parents? Absolutely not. If they were involved in whatever was happening, reaching out to them could put Amina in even greater danger. Realizing he needed guidance, Henry decided to seek advice from someone experienced in dealing with these kinds of situations. He remembered attending a workshop years ago hosted by Child Protective Services, CPS, where professionals explained how to identify signs of abuse and neglect among children. One phrase from the presentation stuck with him. When in doubt, report it. At the time it had seemed like generic advice, but now it felt like a lifeline. Reporting suspicions didn't mean accusing someone outright. It meant giving authorities the information they needed to investigate further and ensure a child's safety. With renewed determination, Henry tucked the note into his pocket and headed straight to the CPS office after finishing his shift. The building was unassuming, a modest structure with pale blue walls and a sign above the door that read, Child Protective Services, in bold letters. As he walked inside, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was he overreacting? Would they take his concerns seriously? Despite his doubts, he approached the receptionist and explained why he was there. I think one of the kids on my bus is being abused, he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The receptionist nodded sympathetically and led him to a private room where a caseworker named Ms. Carter listened intently as Henry recounted everything, the crying, the bruises, the note, the drawings. He handed over the crumpled piece of paper, watching as Ms. Carter examined it closely. Her expression grew increasingly somber as she absorbed the details. This is serious, she finally said, her tone calm but firm. We'll look into it immediately. Can you provide any additional information about Amina's family or living situation? Henry shook his head regretfully. I don't know much beyond what I've told you, he admitted. But I can give you her address and let you know which stop she gets off at every day. Ms. Carter jotted down the details, promising to handle the case discreetly and prioritize Amina's safety above all else. Leaving the CPS office, Henry felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. On one hand, he was glad he'd taken action, trusting that trained professionals would know how to proceed. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. What if Amina's abuser discovered the investigation? What if she blamed him for speaking up? These thoughts haunted him throughout the evening, keeping him awake long after he'd gone to bed. The next morning, as Henry prepared for his route, he wondered how Amina would react when she boarded the bus. Would she sense that something was different? Would she realize he'd found the note? Anxiety prickled at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to focus on the task ahead. When she climbed aboard at 7:15 a.m., she looked paler than usual, her eyes darting nervously around the vehicle. For a moment, their gazes met in the rearview mirror, and Henry saw something flicker in her expression. Fear? Suspicion? Gratitude? He couldn't be sure. Though tempted to say something, to reassure her or offer comfort, he held back. Anything, he said, might inadvertently reveal that he'd reported her situation, potentially putting her in greater danger. Instead, he focused on maintaining his usual routine, hoping his presence alone conveyed a sense of stability and care. Throughout the ride, he kept glancing at her reflection in the mirror, searching for any sign that she was okay, or at least as okay as she could be given the circumstances. That afternoon, as the bus pulled up to Maple Street for drop-off, Henry noticed something unusual. Instead of walking toward her house alone, Amina lingered near the curb, hesitating before taking a step forward. Moments later, a woman appeared beside her, a social worker, judging by her demeanor and clipboard. They exchanged a few quiet words before heading toward the house together. Watching them disappear inside, Henry exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he hoped it would bring Amina closer to safety and peace. Over the following days, Henry continued to observe Amina closely, noting subtle changes in her behavior. She still seemed reserved, but there was a faint softening in her expression, as if some of the tension had begun to ease. Occasionally, she'd glance at him through the mirror, her eyes holding a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. Though they never spoke directly about what had transpired, Henry sensed that she understood, in her own way, that he cared and had done what he thought was best. Reflecting on everything that had unfolded, Henry realized how easy it would have been to overlook the signs. Amina's pain had been hidden beneath layers of silence and fear, masked by her efforts to blend into the background. Yet, by paying attention to the smallest details, the tears, the bruises, the note, he'd uncovered a truth that demanded action. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness come not from grand gestures, but from noticing the quiet moments that others might miss. Henry vowed to carry this lesson with him moving forward. Every child who boarded his bus mattered, and each one deserved to feel seen, heard, and protected. Whether it was offering a spare towel on a rainy morning or reporting a troubling discovery, he knew he had the power to make a difference, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. After all, heroes weren't defined by capes or extraordinary abilities. They were ordinary people willing to act when it mattered most. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly in shades of gray, and raindrops drummed against the windshield like tiny fingers tapping for attention. Henry had started his route earlier than usual, knowing that wet weather always slowed things down. The streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights, and puddles formed in the dips of curbs as he navigated through neighborhoods still waking up. When he pulled up to the corner of Maple Street at 7:15 a.m., Amina was already there, standing beneath a drooping tree with no umbrella or coat. Her dark curls were damp and clung to her face, and her uniform was soaked through in patches, making her look smaller and more fragile than ever. Henry frowned slightly as she stepped onto the bus, water dripping from her clothes onto the floor. He watched her shiver in the cool air of the cabin before settling into her usual seat by the window. Something about seeing her this way tugged at his heartstrings. Without hesitation, he reached under his seat and pulled out a spare towel he kept for emergencies, mostly for spills or muddy shoes, and handed it back to her. "Here," he said softly, catching her eye briefly in the rearview mirror. "Dry off. Can't have you catching a cold." Amina hesitated for a moment, her small hands trembling as she accepted the towel. She murmured a quiet "thank you," so softly that Henry almost missed it. It wasn't much, but hearing those words felt significant somehow, like a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. For the rest of the ride, Henry found himself glancing at her reflection in the mirror more often than usual. She wrapped the towel around her shoulders and stared out the window, her expression distant as if lost in thought, or maybe trying desperately not to think at all. Later that day, when the bus returned to Maple Street for drop-off, Henry noticed something else unusual. As Amina disembarked, she didn't rush toward her house like the other kids. Instead, she lingered near the curb for a moment, clutching her backpack tightly to her chest. Her gaze darted nervously between the bus and her front door, as though weighing some invisible decision. Finally, she trudged forward, her steps slow and deliberate, each movement heavy with reluctance. Watching her disappear inside, Henry couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was something about the way she carried herself, like she was bracing for impact, that made his stomach churn. That evening, as Henry sat in his living room sipping tea, his mind kept circling back to Amina. He replayed fragments of their brief exchange, the way she'd taken the towel, the faintest hint of gratitude in her voice, and wondered what lay behind her guarded exterior. Was she lonely, scared, overwhelmed? The questions swirled endlessly, refusing to let him rest. The next morning, however, brought an opportunity he hadn't expected. As Amina boarded the bus again, looking just as tired and withdrawn as the day before, Henry decided to try breaking the ice once more. "Rough morning?" he asked casually, keeping his tone light and friendly. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of connection. For a long moment, Amina didn't respond. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a jolt of determination coursing through Henry. This wasn't just sadness. It was deeper, darker, and far more complicated than he'd initially imagined. Throughout the day, Henry wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt proud of himself for reaching out, even if only minimally. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that he needed to do more. What if Amina's struggles weren't temporary? What if they were rooted in something far beyond his understanding? The thought gnawed at him relentlessly, urging him to dig deeper without overstepping boundaries. By the time he parked the bus back at the depot that afternoon, Henry's mind was racing. Normally, he'd perform his routine checks, making sure no belongings were left behind, ensuring the seats were clean and intact. But today, his thoughts were consumed by Amina. He replayed every detail of their interaction, analyzing her body language, her hesitation, her guardedness. And then, as he prepared to leave, inspiration struck. Maybe there was a way to learn more without prying directly. Kneeling beside the third-row seat where Amina always sat, Henry began inspecting carefully. At first, he told himself he was simply checking for forgotten items, a common occurrence among students, but deep down he hoped to find something more. Something that might explain why she cried every morning, why she seemed so afraid, why she carried such a weight on her young shoulders. As he leaned closer to peer underneath the seat, his breath caught in his throat. Wedged tightly against the metal frame was a crumpled piece of paper, partially hidden by shadows. Heart-pounding, Henry reached for it and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, clearly written in haste, but the message was unmistakable. "Please don't tell anyone what happens at home." Beneath the plea were crude drawings of stick figures, one large figure towering menacingly over two smaller ones, fists raised as if ready to strike. The images sent a chill down Henry's spine. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The tears, the bruises, the fear in Amina's eyes. It all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. This sweet, quiet girl was living in a nightmare, trapped in a situation too terrifying to speak about openly. Henry sat back on his heels, the note trembling in his hands. His mind raced with possibilities. How long had she been carrying this burden alone? Had anyone else noticed? More importantly, what could he do to help? The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but so did the resolve to act. If he ignored, this turned a blind eye. He knew he'd never forgive himself. But stepping in came with risks he wasn't entirely prepared for. Over the next few hours, Henry debated his options. Should he confront Amina directly, call her parents, report it anonymously? Each choice carried its own set of complications, and the uncertainty left him feeling paralyzed. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear of making things worse, one thing became crystal clear: doing nothing was not an option. Whatever happened next, he vowed to approach it with care, compassion, and unwavering dedication. Little did Henry realize, his decision to investigate further would set off a chain of events that would change both his life and Amina's forever. The days following Henry's visit to Child Protective Services were a blur of uncertainty. He went about his routine as usual, picking up and dropping off students along his route, but his mind was constantly preoccupied with thoughts of Amina. Each morning he braced himself for her arrival at the Maple Street stop, wondering if she'd sensed that something had changed. Would she still trust him? Would she hate him for getting involved? These questions lingered in the back of his mind like an unwelcome shadow. On the third day after his report, Henry noticed something different when Amina boarded the bus. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a woman in professional attire, khaki, slacks, a pressed blouse, and a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her demeanor was calm yet authoritative, and she greeted Henry with a polite nod before introducing herself as Ms. Carter, the same caseworker he'd spoken to at CPS. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly. "I'll be accompanying Amina today." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. This was it. The moment he'd been dreading and anticipating all at once. The presence of the social worker confirmed that the investigation was underway, but it also meant that Amina's world was about to shift dramatically. He nodded silently, trying to mask his emotions as he glanced at Amina through the rearview mirror. She looked smaller than ever, her hands clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. There was fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. As the bus rumbled along its route, Henry kept stealing glances at Amina in the mirror. She sat quietly in her usual seat, staring out the window as always, but her posture seemed less rigid this time. Was it relief? Or simply exhaustion? He couldn't tell. The weight of knowing what she must be going through gnawed at him. How could someone so young endure such turmoil without crumbling completely? Yet here she was, enduring it with a quiet strength that left him in awe. When the bus arrived at Maple Street that afternoon, Henry watched as Amina stepped off alongside Ms. Carter. They walked toward her house together, their steps slow and deliberate. It struck him how vulnerable she looked, clinging to the edge of the social worker's presence like a lifeline. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might happen next. Would she stay with her family, be placed in foster care, move away entirely? The possibilities swirled endlessly in his mind, each one carrying its own set of challenges and uncertainties. Over the next few weeks, Henry heard nothing official about the investigation. CPS operated discreetly, prioritizing the child's safety above all else, which meant updates were rare unless absolutely necessary. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how things were progressing. Was Amina safe now? Had they uncovered the full extent of what she'd endured? These unanswered questions haunted him during long stretches of silence on the bus, especially when he passed by the empty seat where she used to sit. Then, one crisp morning about a month later, Henry pulled up to the Maple Street stop and saw Amina waiting there. Not alone, but accompanied by another adult. This time it wasn't Ms. Carter. Instead, a kind-looking woman with warm brown eyes stood beside her, holding her hand gently. As they approached the bus, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Bennett, Amina's temporary foster mother. "We're so grateful for everything you've done," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Henry blinked in surprise, caught off guard by the unexpected gratitude. I didn't do much," he stammered, though his heart swelled with emotion. "I just noticed something wasn't right." Mrs. Bennett smiled knowingly. "Sometimes noticing is enough," she replied. You gave us the chance to step in and make things better for her. We can't thank you enough." Hearing those words hit Henry like a wave of relief. All the sleepless nights, the doubts, the fears, they melted away in that moment. Knowing that his actions had truly made a difference filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When Amina climbed aboard the bus and settled into her seat, she finally met his gaze directly. For the first time in months, her eyes weren't clouded with sadness or fear. Instead, they sparkled faintly, reflecting a newfound sense of security. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. But Henry heard it clearly, and it carried the weight of the world. Those two words weren't just an expression of gratitude. They were a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of human connection. As the days turned into weeks, Henry began to notice subtle changes in Amina. She no longer cried on the bus, and her once slumped shoulders straightened slightly, as if she were learning to carry herself with pride again. Occasionally, she'd exchange shy smiles with other kids, joining in their laughter during lighter moments. Though she remained reserved, there was a softness to her demeanor now, a fragility tempered by hope. Through conversations with Mrs. Bennet, Henry learned more about Amina's new life. She was adjusting well to her foster home, surrounded by people who cared deeply about her well-being. The authorities had determined that her previous living situation was unsafe, and while legal proceedings were ongoing, Amina was finally in a place where she could heal. Hearing these updates brought tears to Henry's eyes, not tears of sorrow but of joy. Joy that she was safe. Joy that she was thriving. Joy that he'd played even a small role in making it possible. Reflecting on everything that had transpired, Henry realized how interconnected their lives had become. His decision to investigate further, to pay attention to the details others might overlook, had set off a chain reaction that transformed Amina's future. It reminded him of something he'd always believed but rarely acted upon. Kindness doesn't have to be grandiose to be meaningful. Sometimes the simplest gestures, a spare towel on a rainy day, a gentle question, a willingness to listen, can create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Henry vowed to carry this lesson forward, not just for Amina but for every child who stepped onto his bus. From then on, he made it a point to greet each passenger with a smile, to check in with them when they seemed troubled, and to remind himself daily that everyone carries burdens invisible to the naked eye. Whether it was offering encouragement, lending an ear, or simply being present, he knew he had the power to make a difference even in small ways. And so, as the seasons changed and the bus route continued its steady rhythm, Henry found renewed purpose in his work. Every morning he'd wake up early, brew his coffee, and head out to the depot with a heart full of determination. Because somewhere out there, another Amina might need someone to notice. And if he could be that person, if he could offer even a fraction of the comfort and support she'd received, he knew his life would be richer for it. Months had passed since Amina's life took a dramatic turn, and Henry could see the transformation in her with every passing day. The once timid girl who used to board his bus with tear-streaked cheeks and downcast eyes now carried herself with a quiet confidence that warmed his heart. Her uniform was always neat, her hair tied back in tidy braids, and though she still preferred sitting alone by the window, there was a new lightness to her presence. She smiled more often now, small, tentative smiles at first, but over time they grew brighter, fuller, as if she were rediscovering what it meant to feel safe and happy. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around the bus stop, Amina stepped onto the bus holding a small envelope. Henry watched her curiously through the rearview mirror as she walked up to him, her steps hesitant but deliberate. "Mr. Thompson?" she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Henry turned slightly in his seat, surprised, to hear her speak directly to him for the first time. "Yes, Amina," he replied, his tone gentle. She held out the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is for you," she said, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away. "Thank you. For everything." Henry accepted the envelope with care, feeling its weight in his hands. He wanted to say something, to express how proud he was of her, how much she inspired him. But words failed him. Instead, he gave her a warm smile and nodded. "You're welcome, Amina," he said simply, hoping his gratitude and admiration shone through. After Amina returned to her seat, Henry couldn't resist peeking inside the envelope during a quiet stretch of the route. Inside was a hand-drawn card, its edges slightly uneven but filled with vibrant colors. On the front was a picture of a yellow school bus driving along a sunny road, surrounded by trees bursting with autumn hues. Beneath it, written in careful block letters, were the words, "To my hero." Opening the card, Henry found a heartfelt message inside. "Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for noticing me when no one else did. You saved my life and I will never forget it. Because of you, I am safe now. Love, Amina." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he read the note over and over again. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined being called a hero. To him, he'd simply done what anyone should do: pay attention, take action, and trust that doing the right thing mattered even when it felt uncertain or risky. Yet here was proof in ink and crayon that his actions had changed someone's world forever. As weeks turned into months, Henry continued to stay updated on Amina's progress through occasional conversations with Mrs. Bennett, her foster mother. She shared stories of how Amina was thriving in her new environment. At school, she'd begun participating in class discussions and joining art clubs, where her creativity flourished. At home, she laughed freely with her foster siblings, played board games on weekends, and helped bake cookies in the kitchen. Each update brought Henry immense joy, knowing that she was finally living a life free from fear. But perhaps the most touching moment came one spring afternoon, several months after Amina's placement in foster care. As the bus pulled up to Maple Street for drop-off, Henry noticed a familiar figure waiting near the curb. Not Mrs. Bennett this time, but Amina herself, standing beside a younger boy who looked about 7 years old. When they boarded the bus together, Amina introduced him proudly. "This is Daniel," she said, her voice steady and confident. "He's my little foster brother." Henry smiled warmly at the boy, who grinned back shyly. "Welcome aboard, Daniel," he said. Then turning to Amina, he added, "Looks like you've got your hands full taking care of him." Amina chuckled softly, a sound so rare and precious that it made Henry's heart swell. "I'm trying," she said, glancing fondly at Daniel. "He reminds me of myself sometimes, scared and unsure, but I want to help him feel better, just like people helped me." Her words struck a chord deep within Henry. Here was Amina, not only healing from her own wounds, but also extending kindness and support to someone else. It was a testament to her resilience and compassion, qualities that had been buried under layers of pain, but were now shining brightly. Watching her interact with Daniel, guiding him gently to their seats, Henry realized that Amina wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving and inspiring others along the way. Over time, Amina became a regular fixture on Henry's bus, her laughter mingling with those of her peers. Other kids started seeking her company, drawn to her quiet strength and artistic talents. During art projects at school, she often led group activities, encouraging classmates to express themselves freely. Teachers noticed the change too, praising her leadership skills and positive attitude. Slowly but surely, Amina was becoming a role model, a beacon of hope for anyone who crossed her path. For Henry, witnessing this transformation reinforced his belief in the power of paying attention. If he hadn't noticed Amina's tears, hadn't followed his instincts to investigate further, her story might have ended very differently. But because he chose to act, with empathy, courage, and determination, he gave her a chance to rewrite her future. And in doing so, he reminded himself why he loved his job so much. It wasn't just about driving kids to and from school. It was about creating a space where they felt seen, valued, and protected. Years later, long after Amina had grown up and moved on to high school, college, and eventually adulthood, Henry would still think about her often. Occasionally, she'd send him updates, a letter sharing her achievements, a photo of her graduating, or news of her plans to study social work so she could help children facing similar struggles. Each message filled him with pride, knowing that the cycle of kindness had come full circle. Amina wasn't just surviving, she was giving back, using her experiences to make the world a better place. On one particularly memorable occasion, Amina visited Henry at the bus depot. Now in her mid-20s, she stood before him with a radiant smile, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You showed me that even in the darkest moments there are people willing to step in and care. That's why I chose to become a social worker, to be that person for others just like you were for me." Henry felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as he embraced her warmly. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've already repaid me 100 times over by becoming the incredible person you are today." As they parted ways that day, Henry reflected on the ripple effect of kindness. One small act, handing a towel to a crying child, had set off a chain reaction that touched countless lives, including his own. It reminded him that heroes aren't defined by extraordinary feats. They're ordinary people who choose to notice, to care, and to act when it matters most. And so, Henry continued his daily routine with renewed purpose, greeting each passenger with a smile and keeping an open heart, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in a world full of noise and distractions, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can create waves of change that last a lifetime.